The next item of business is a statement by Michael Matheson on COVID-19 transport. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to provide Parliament with an update on the developments of this Government's COVID-19 Transport Transition Plan as we begin to chart the route map outlined by the First Minister last Thursday through and out of this crisis. May I first of all reiterate my thanks to the people of Scotland who have heeded the Government's advice not to travel unless absolutely necessary. Following that advice is what has allowed us to set out the first iteration of the Transport Transition Plan today. But the virus is still with us. If we move too quickly or without appropriate diligence, it could rapidly run out of control again. So in that context, our Transport Transition Plan must be dynamic and capable of evolving as lockdown measures are gradually eased. It will be intrinsically linked to the plans for reopening our schools and economic recovery being set out to Parliament later this afternoon. Our plan will present a careful and measured approach to a fluid situation in which we must continue to adopt the behaviours which have brought us to this point. Presiding Officer, Scotland is planning for a managed transition away from the current restrictions in a way that enables the suppression of the virus to continue. This Government is taking an open and transparent approach to this in line with the proposition set out initially in our framework for decision-making document published last month and now in the First Minister's route map out of lockdown. We are now moving towards phase 1 of that route map. The route map outlines the key high-level messages that, firstly, working from home should remain the default position where it can, with the reopening of a limited number of workplaces set out in this phase. And where home working is not possible, businesses and organisations are encouraged to manage travel demand through staggered start times and flexible working patterns. Secondly, people can travel short distances for outdoor leisure and exercise, but the advice is to stay within a short distance of your local community and travel by walking, wheeling and cycling where possible. So our Transport Transition Plan is informed by and expands upon these key high-level messages. Presiding Officer, transport will help facilitate the recovery of our health, society and economy by allowing people to get around again, accessing services, jobs, friends and family. But I will start with the reminder that to protect the integrity of our public transport system as we transition, it is of paramount importance that everyone continues to take personal responsibility for both their own safety and that of others who they may come into contact when travelling. Our plan will be developed to ensure that the people of Scotland are safe while travelling and that our transport operators are themselves safe at work. We've engaged with trade unions, passenger groups, operators, COSLA, local authorities and regional transport partnerships. And I'd emphasise strongly that we will continue to work with them in the weeks and months ahead as the plan evolves. Presiding Officer, as a consequence of the phased approach outlined in the route map, there are 3 separate strands in our transport response to the pandemic through the immediate, medium and long term. They are easing restrictions on daily life and movement, supporting economic recovery with both the transport sector and broader economy, and developing the future of transport in Scotland. As part of this first iteration of the plan, we are publishing clear guidance to support the transport sector in moving to restart and recovery, and providing guidance for passengers making use of public transport. The top-level message I'd like to convey is that the level of physical distancing needed as we navigate the phases of the route map will obviously affect the supply of public transport capacity, with operators estimating that 2-metre physical distancing will mean capacity is somewhere between 10 and 25% of normal. As a result, a system that typically had 1.5 million people journeys per day, with peak in demand at 100% capacity, will have substantial constraints upon it. Our Transport Transition Plan has a number of national aims, and over the coming weeks and months, we will work with local authorities to operationalise these at a local level. Our plan will inform passengers about when and how to access public transport safely, support management of travel demand, reinforcing broader messages on physical distancing and discouraging unnecessary travel, sustain behaviour changes, encouraging active travel options and staggering journeys to avoid peak times, informing passengers and road users of busy areas and times to encourage alternative choices. Presiding Officer, guided by our principles of ensuring safety, transport operators and authorities are planning for physical distancing and an increasing level of cleaning measures on public transport and at bus and rail stations, ferry terminals and airports. The importance of distancing and hygiene on board public transport and at these public transport hubs will be critical to the success of this plan. While transport operators and authorities will ensure that the transport environment is as safe as possible, we all have a personal responsibility to take steps to protect ourselves and others. It is vital that we continue to keep 2 metres physical distancing wherever possible, washing hands regularly and maintaining good respiratory hygiene. Even with the measures being put in place by transport operators, it can be difficult for people to maintain physical distancing throughout their journey in some forms of public transport. I know from my discussions with the trade unions, operators and from the surveys of public sentiment that these are real and live concerns. For that reason, people should and are expected to wear face coverings as an additional measure when using public transport and as a consideration to staff and to fellow passengers. Please come prepared with your face covering when using public transport. Of course, there will be situations where this is not practical, which the guidance reflects in its detail. Furthermore, it is vital that when using face coverings, the public follow our guidelines on their use, which includes ensuring a high level of hygiene. We will, of course, keep this position under regular review to reflect any new evidence that becomes available. Presiding Officer, we are looking to increase the frequency of public transport for Phase 2 of the route map. Although, given the restrictions on the amount of people we will be able to carry, we need fewer people than normal to travel, particularly at busy times. And as I've stated, and in line with the route map, we are urging employers to show leadership and to be as flexible as possible to allow earlier and later starting and finishing times for those who have to travel. So while we move through the phases, we will need to manage expectation in our public transport network around, for example, travelling into cities, recognising that it will not be possible to satisfy demand fully and ensure that our recovery is fair, sustainable and does not exacerbate inequalities in our system. And we will continue to work with a range of stakeholders, transport operators, passengers, local authorities, education, health and business to inform the easing of the restrictions and manage demand for transport based on the evidence we gather. As an example, the Scottish Government is working with local authorities and transport operators to ensure that transport is in place to get children to school. Importantly, our plan will look to support the reallocation of road space, giving priority to cycling, walking, wheeling and bus. We have a real opportunity to secure a positive and lasting change in our sustainable travel habits. Continuing to walk, cycle or wheel will allow us to sustain the improved air quality we've benefited from since lockdown. Presiding Officer, in April, I announced the Spaces for People Fund, providing £10 million of funding for local authorities to introduce temporary walking and cycling infrastructure to enable physical distancing. I'm delighted with the response from local authorities to this offer, and we have already received applications or expressions of interest exceeding the initial £10 million. So I'm very pleased to announce today that we will increase this fund up to £30 million with immediate effect. I want all local authorities, urban and rural, to have the opportunity and support to access this fund. Presiding Officer, as I said, we will carry on developing the Transport Transition Plan as we move through the phases of the route map, continuing to gather evidence to inform its evolution and ever mindful of taking corrective steps should that be required. The Transport Transition Plan aims to help the transport system as accessible as possible while travelling only when necessary and maintaining physical distancing. Presiding Officer, we need to make sure we continue to take forward the measures that will support people in using our transport system while at the same time in managing the challenges with the virus. And I would encourage transport operators and the public to make use of the guidance published today.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement, and I intend to allow around 30 minutes for questions. Then we'll move on. With those members who wish to ask a question, please press the request to speak buttons. And I first of all call Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for an advance copy of his statement. Let me also add my thanks to all the transport workers across Scotland who have kept the country moving during this crisis. As the Cabinet Secretary said, the transport sector will play a crucial role in helping Scotland emerge from lockdown, and the Transport Transition Plan announced today is a welcome start. But there are a number of questions on how this plan is going to work in practice. First, can the Cabinet Secretary provide assurance to frontline transport workers that there will be adequate supplies of PPE for those who need it? Second, with respect to social distancing measures required on the rail and bus networks, transport operators have raised concerns that this might not be possible to achieve during rush hour periods. So can the Cabinet Secretary clarify whether transport marshals or other officers will be deployed to monitor compliance with social distancing requirements, or will travellers be expected to self-regulate on these matters? And finally, in relation to the coach sector, I have sent the Cabinet Secretary a number of letters highlighting concerns that coach operators are not getting sufficient support during the crisis, and as a result, many face going out of business, which will badly affect the tourism sector in Scotland when this market reopens. So can the Cabinet Secretary tell us how he intends to address those serious concerns raised by coach operators?
Michael Matheson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm grateful to the member for his questions. On his latter point, I'm sure he heard the response from Fergus Ewing on the issue of the coach industry, which Fergus Ewing is leading on, and no doubt he will keep the member informed and respond to his correspondence in due course. In relation to the supply of PPE, if the member looks at the detail within the guidance, there's a very clear hierarchy of risks which is set out within the guidance that operators, employers have to undertake as part of the risk assessment they should be carrying out for their staff. Within that hierarchy, PPE is the final point that they should arrive at, because they should be looking to put mitigation measures in place in order to minimise the need for the use of PPE. From the discussions that we've had with the transport sector, they've given us assurances that they have sufficient stocks of PPE in place in order to meet that need as and when it should arise. But the guidance also emphasises the need to ensure that as they undertake the risk assessment, they engage not only with the employees affected, but also with their health and safety representatives, trade unions, etc., to ensure that that's carried out in a compliant way and one which they are comfortable with, and will continue to keep that under review as with all other parts of the guidance as we go forward. In terms of compliance, what is absolutely critical here is that the reality is that a transport system which is constrained by physical distancing, which will constrain it to such an extent that it may at best in some modes only be able to carry around a quarter of the number of people who would make use of it, is that we can't expect the transport system just to absorb that pressure. People need to take responsibility for their own decisions, including looking at whether they can start earlier or later to avoid peak times. Employers need to demonstrate leadership in being prepared to support staff who can work from home to be able to continue to work from home. If they do have to come into work, is allowing them to be flexible in their start and finish times, to look at staggering the days that they may be able to work from their home and into their office space, looking at flexibility. So the business community, public sector, operators, individuals all have a part to play in helping to meet the challenges which we'll face with a constrained transport system. And that's why it's important there's a collective effort in recognising the challenges which our transport sector will face in the weeks and months ahead.
I now call Colin Smith.
Thank you, President Officer, and thank you to the Cabinet Secretary for the advance sight of his statement. Labour recognises the challenge the Government faces increasing public transport capacity as we ease out of lockdown, while ensuring what must be our #1 priority, the safety of passengers and our transport workers, who we owe a huge debt of gratitude to. Which is why, President Officer, there can't be any ambiguity. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary why there does appear to be so much ambiguity in the guidance he's published today? It states, for example, when travelling by bus, tram or rail, you should and are expected to wear a face covering. Does the Cabinet Secretary accept that should or expected cannot be enforced? Under this guidance, there is in fact nothing to stop anyone getting on public transport without a face covering, not just those who cannot wear face coverings for practical reasons. The Cabinet Secretary has also just said that PPE will only be a last resort. So can he tell us what specific new measures he's announced today to protect our key frontline transport workers? And does his position on PPE and indeed this transition plan have the full agreement of the trade unions? And finally, it seems social distancing on public transport will be largely self-policed. So what future support will the Government provide to ensure there will be sufficient capacity to allow that distancing? And will the Cabinet Secretary give a personal commitment we will not witness the scenes we saw in England of overcrowded, dangerous buses and trains in our cities at peak times?
Michael Matheson.
So let me try and deal with the points which the members raised in turn regarding face coverings. The expectation is that if you are travelling in public transport, you should have a face covering. However, there are some modes of transport where that is not appropriate and not necessary. That's why it is an expectation that has been set out very clearly in the guidance. So if you don't have a pre-existing medical condition, which would suggest that you should not have a face covering, if you're on a mode of transport which is anything other than that of a ferry, then you should have a face covering. Not only as a matter of courtesy to other travellers, but also to those who work within the transport sector. And the guidance is very clear on that particular point. In relation to transport workers on PPE and the hierarchy, the member will recognise that this hierarchy is not something which is specific to the transport sector. It is also contained within the construction sector guidance about the need to make sure that employers put in place mitigation measures to minimise the risk of staff having their 2 metres being compromised. Where there is a risk identified that could occur, then they should be looking at what appropriate PPE measures they should be putting in place. And that's exactly why within the guidance it sets out in detail the need to make sure that operators apply the assessment process to identify any risk. And as I mentioned to Dean Lockhart, the feedback we have had from transport providers is that in the circumstances where they believe that PPE may be a matter that has to be addressed through any assessment process, that they have sufficient stocks and supply chains for that. In relation to the issue of distancing, I'm sure the member will recognise that a system that is as complex as our public transport system, there will inevitably be pinch points within it where 2 metres will be compromised. By the very nature and design of it, that will occur. What we are doing is taking a proportionate, measured way to try and make sure that we minimise the risks of that taking place. And rather than announcing on a Sunday night that things will go back to normal on a Monday, Tuesday or Wednesday, we're giving due notice about the timescale for which we will take this forward in order to allow transport operators, employers and the public to plan for this. Everyone has a part to play. Politicians, the public, employers, leaders within our community, in making sure we get the message across that we have to make sure that in using public transport while it's constrained, that we look at trying to avoid making unnecessary journeys and that we comply with the guidance that's been issued today.
We move to open questions. I have Kenneth Gibson to be followed by John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this statement, which confirms the route map includes supporting economic recovery within both the transport sector and broader economy, ensuring safety at bus and rail stations, ferry terminals and airports. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that quarantining people travelling to the UK should have been introduced months ago, rather than when the UK is one of the highest COVID-19 death rates in the world? Absolutely a case of closing the stable door after the horse is bolted, inflicting further damage on our economy from aviation to tourism. And given that the relatively inexpensive DNA nudge test can produce an accurate result in 75 minutes, it would be better to test arrivals at our airports and ports rather than quarantine them.
Michael Masterson.
Presiding Officer, the arrangements which we have in place in aviation, particularly at our airports, is guided by the advice that's provided by Health Protection Scotland for the messages which are provided to the travelling public who may be coming into the country, whether it be through a domestic route or whether it be through an international route. In relation to matters regarding quarantine, the member will recognise that this is an area which is reserved to the UK Government. We remain engaged with the UK Government around the issue of quarantine and their proposals for to be introduced to airports in June next month. As it stands at the present moment, there is still some uncertainty as to how some of the arrangements will operate. But what I can assure the member is that we will continue to engage with the UK Government to ensure that the needs of the aviation sector in Scotland are reflected in any guidance which is implemented.
John Finney to be followed by Gordon Lyndhurst.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of his statement and accompanying documents. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that there's a system of safer routes to school already in existence, and of course it doesn't have regard to social distancing requirements. I know what the Cabinet Secretary says about sustaining behavioural change and of course welcome the new money and the encouragement of active travel, walking and cycling. Self-evidently, you can only cycle to school if you have a bike. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what steps the Scottish Government has taken to ensure all children have access to a bike? And will he consider Scottish Green Party proposal of £100 bike grants to all children presently eligible for school uniform grant to ensure the widest possible benefit from the welcome changes already underway?
Michael Masterson.
Officer, the member raises an important issue about seeking to try and capture the behavioural changes which we have witnessed over recent weeks in the increasing number of people who are making use of active travel options, whether that be walking, wheeling or cycling. And the member will recognise the very significant measures we've put in place with the additional funding again announced today to support local authorities to look at developing and putting in place pop-up infrastructure that can support physical distancing while assisting people to walk, cycle and wheel. I'm as keen as Mr Finney is to make sure that we try to make sure that if there is a lasting legacy from the existing lockdown arrangements, is that we continue to have people making use of active travel in the months and years ahead. What I can assure the member of is that he'll be aware that we have a range of different schemes in place to bikeability, etc., to support young people at schools in looking at cycling. What we are presently doing is looking at the existing schemes that we have in place to see whether they can be tailored in such a way that they meet some of that growing need that there may be to support young people in looking at cycling as being an option for them in accessing school. So I can assure the member the issue which he has raised is one which we are already giving consideration to, although what I can't do is I can't give a commitment at this stage to the very specific proposal which the member has put forward this afternoon.
Gordon Lyndhurst, to be followed by Mike Rumbles.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary has referred to guidance which comments on an unprecedented package of support from the Scottish and UK governments to the transport sector, and also refers to a basis of further specific support to be considered in due course. Now, the UK government has provided the Scottish government with Barnett consequentials of £339 million as a result of spending on transport elsewhere. Will the Cabinet Secretary confirm today that the full £339 million will be allocated in its entirety to the transport sector here in Scotland?
Michael Matheson.
So what I can say to the member on that specific point is that we moved very quickly to provide support to the transport sector in Scotland at the very outset of the pandemic. In fact, we are the only part of the UK that has gone, if I'm correct, I think certainly we are, if not the only part, one of the few parts that have actually gone as far to support our aviation sector, unlike other parts of the UK. So, for example, we have given a business rates relief to our airports and to our aviation-based industries in order to try to support them through what is a very difficult economic time. So the member should be in absolutely no doubt about our commitment to help to support and sustain our transport sector going forward, and that will continue to be a focus in the weeks and months ahead.
Mike Rumbles, to be followed by Alistair Allen.
The Cabinet Secretary must know that people who need to travel on the train will get onto it if they can. Has the Transport Secretary considered, therefore, recommending a booking system only, particularly for rail travel, to ensure that people who need to travel can do so safely, as there might only be, as he says himself, a safe 10% capacity on the train? Otherwise, we could be facing some of the scenes of chaos that we've seen down south.
Michael Matheson.
Sign officer, we are looking at a range of options to try to help to manage aspects of demand. There are arrangements presently in place for longer journeys that you can only book a train ticket for longer journeys if you do so in advance. The challenge is on short commuter journeys, where it is much more difficult to manage those numbers. So if you think in an area such as the Strathclyde Electrics area alone, it represents 40% of our rail network numbers. And many of those are individuals who are only making 1 or 2 stops on rail. So a booking system in that type of environment wouldn't work. So it becomes very challenging in order to operate it in that way. But the member is right that the existing assessment that's been carried out by ScotRail is that capacity on our rail network will be constrained to between 11 and 14%, depending upon the type of train that's been used on a particular route. That's why it's critically important that we don't simply expect that we can put systems in place that allow the transport system to go back to normal and to meet that demand, is that businesses, individuals all have to take the responsibility of looking at changing working arrangements and encouraging people to work at home, flexible start and finish times to avoid having to travel at peak times, the public looking to try to make use of active travel for short distances rather than using trains or buses at peak times as well, all looking at the role we can play to try and help to manage that demand. But it's simply not possible to expect that we can put a simple system in place that will be able to manage the demand within the transport system of it simply getting back to normal again.
Alistair Allen, who is joining us remotely, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Presiding Officer, the travel restrictions on ferries to and from the Western Isles have had an important role in containing the spread of the virus in the islands. With last week's publication of the route map for moving out of lockdown, can the Cabinet Secretary outline how the travel restrictions to the islands will fit into that route map And particularly, can the Cabinet Secretary give any assurances that any discussions between Transport Scotland and ferry operators regarding timetables for this summer will reflect the need for any changes to be both gradual and done with great care?
Michael Matheson.
Officer, the Transport Transition Plan sits alongside the route map which the First Minister set out last Thursday. And as we move through those phases within the route map, the Transition Plan will adapt to make sure that we address the transport needs that may be required in order to meet any increase in demand. And that will include ferry services to our island communities. What I can say to the member is that we are acutely aware of some of the concerns and issues that our island communities may have around any changes in the existing timetable arrangements. Only this morning a discussion took place between Transport Scotland and our island authorities to explore this very issue. So what I can assure the member is that before there are any changes made to the timetabling arrangements for ferry services, is that there will be engagement with the island authorities to look at these issues and to ensure that any changes are introduced in a way which is appropriate. What I can also say to the member is that ferry capacity is likely to be very significantly constrained with physical distancing. CalMac estimate that their network will be constrained to in the region of 17 to 18% capacity because of physical distancing. That in itself will have a very significant impact on who can use our ferry services. And that's part of our thinking and our planning around how we make sure that any increase in demand for ferry services reflects the needs of our island community. So I can give the member that assurance, and we'll continue to have that engagement as we go forward, as we move through the phases of the route map.
Sarah Boyack, followed by John Mason.
Cabinet Secretary, the UK's best bus company, Lothian Buses, owned by local authorities, is under massive pressure with 90% loss of revenue and hundreds of jobs on the line. Their buses have seen investment to make them safer for staff and passengers and are key to getting our economy moving again and to let people travel safely. So will the Scottish Government follow the UK Government's support for Transport for London and provide support to Lothian Buses and Edinburgh Trams now to ensure that when we have moved on from the lockdown, we have the public transport available for people in the Lothians and for those using park and ride facilities from the Central Belt, from Fife and from the south of Scotland?
Excuse me, could you speak a wee bit quieter over in this corner, please? Michael Matheson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I won't mention who you're referring to, Mr Crawford. But I recognise the concern which has been raised by Sarah Boyack, and I can advise her that we've already engaged with Edinburgh City Council around the challenges which they have with Lothian buses and also with the tram services which they operate. The member will recognise, though, that in ramping up bus services again to try and meet any increase in demand, given the constraints they will have in terms of capacity, the vast majority of bus services across the country will effectively be running at a loss because they are not able to run at the capacity they would normally have in order to make sure that they meet the costs of those services. So the discussions which we are having, not only with Lothians, but as with public bus service operators across the country, is to understand the potential impact that has for them financially. So if we expect them to increase capacity in the weeks and months ahead, then it needs to be financially viable for them to do so because of the loss in revenue which they are facing as a result of physical distancing. And that's why we're having to undertake a level of detailed work with operators to understand that fully and to look at what measures we can put in place to help to support them to ensure that we can see an increase in bus services as we move forward in the weeks and months ahead, and that includes Lothian buses.
I'd just let people know that unless we speed up with the questions and answers, I'm certainly not going to get everyone in. John Mason, followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you very much. We've spent recent years, Cabinet Secretary, encouraging people to use public transport, but now in the short term, we're kind of discouraging them. Can you say anything about how the balance is struck here so we don't put people off public transport long term?
Michael Matheson.
Officer, I hope that the public would take reassurance from the guidance which has been issued today, not only for operators, because there are two elements of the guidance, two parts to the guidance. There is the operators guidance, and there's also the public guidance on making use of public transport. So we want to encourage people to consider that guidance and to make use of it if they're having to make use of public transport. But the reality is that it will remain constrained for a considerable period of time while physical distancing remains in place. That's why it is critical that we see the right type of leadership within businesses in helping to support their staff to continue to work from home for extended periods of time, that they are flexible in the work routines if staff have to come into work to try and avoid peak time travel, that the public can have assurance that the bus operators, rail operators, other public transport providers are putting enhanced cleaning regimes in place, that they're putting management systems in place at particular transport hubs to support people in maintaining physical distancing, putting out clear messaging around how they should purchase tickets, and if so, to do so contactless and in advance of their journey. These measures collectively can help to support people who do need to make use of public transport, but they can be assured that we're doing everything possible to try to help to manage physical distancing and also hygiene on the public transport network. But equally, we need others to play their part. Individual personal responsibility and also businesses in the public sector to look at work arrangements to try to help to minimise the risk of peak demand getting to a point where it compromises physical distancing extensively on the transport network.
Graham Simpson, followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you. In April, the Cabinet Secretary announced the £10 million Spaces for People Fund. He said at the time that he thought some schemes could be up and running within 2 weeks. Can you tell us if that has transpired? If so, which ones they are? Can he publish a list of the schemes which have been approved? Now, the Spaces for People Fund, that money for that was taken from the Places for Everyone Fund, which was for permanent schemes. So is this extra £20 million also recycled money?
Michael Matheson.
Presiding Officer, unfortunately Mr Simpson's a bit behind the curve because actually from announcing it in less than a week, Edinburgh had already put in road closures in a number of routes in Edinburgh in response to the guidance which we issued and the creation of the fund. Glasgow have just in the course of, I believe, the last fortnight opened up the Clydeside Expressway cycle route, which I think is about 1.5 kilometres of cycleway that has been introduced. And Edinburgh Council have announced today the further measures that they intend to take forward as part of the Spaces for People Fund. So there is already schemes in place, and there are plans for further schemes, not just in the big cities, but across areas such as Lanarkshire and also in the Highlands as well. So we are seeing schemes rolling out, and I would encourage a member to continue to engage with councils as they take that forward. In terms of it being the funding which is being recycled, the Spaces for Everyone funding is for permanent structures. He is correct. The challenge is that because of the lockdown arrangements and the restrictions that we have at the present time, local authorities are not able to develop schemes and take those forward in the way in which they would normally. So rather than that money remaining locked and not used, we are freeing it up to allow it to be used for a different purpose, which is temporary infrastructure. Some of that temporary infrastructure may become permanent infrastructure going forward, but it's about making sure that we free up the money so it can be used now to benefit people rather than lying there and not being used in a way that could have benefited people in supporting physical distancing and active travel in the weeks and months ahead.
Claire Baker, followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Many young people travel on contract school buses and others access public transport. Can I ask, will the public transport standards, the wearing of masks and the social distancing, be applied to school transport? Will local authorities be funded to negotiate the bus contracts? And will there be a prioritisation system applied in public transport to get young people safely to school and not be in situations where they are denied boarding? And can I just add that if bus drivers are expected to have to deal with this and other potentially challenging situations, does the transition plan have the full agreement of the trade unions?
Michael Matheson.
Presiding Officer, we have fully engaged with the trade unions in the shaping of the transition plan and the guidance, and they were consulted in that process and have given us feedback on issues relating to that, some of which have been incorporated, some of which will be reviewed as we go forward, and that engagement will continue as we progress this. In relation to specific matters in regard to education, bus contracts, the member will be already aware that COSLA has already issued guidance to local authorities in funding around these matters and continue to fund bus contracts for education purposes to the end of the school term. Any arrangements around that going forward in the future is a matter which we are engaging with our colleagues in education around, because it's an area where education lead on these matters, and we will support them around what the demand and potential impact could be on transport. And therefore, I would expect any arrangements for school transport to reflect the need to have social distancing being maintained. In relation to the member's very specific point about buses not being able to, not allowed young people to board if they're trying to go to school, that's some of the issues which we need to look at and to see how we can address those effectively. So is there a way in which we can stagger start times for schools, which would help to reduce the potential risk of buses being busy at peak times? All of these issues are being explored, and that's the type of discussion which we're having with our counterparts, my colleague, the Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Education, to make sure that we understand what the implications could be for transport and what mitigation measures can be put in place to try to help to manage demand.
Bob Doris, to be followed by JB Green.
Presiding Officer, I want to thank bus drivers for the unenviable task of trying to implement the major reduction of seating capacity on buses. I'll see that for myself this evening when I get the 7 bus back to Marehill later tonight. Can I ask how the Scottish Government will support bus companies to significantly increase the frequency of buses, which will undoubtedly be required, ensure that revised timetables are displayed at every bus stop so that all passengers are fully informed, just not only those with smartphones, and to ensure that bus companies identify and rectify pinch points on routes so that some passengers don't constantly have buses running past them due to unavoidable capacity restrictions.
Michael Matheson.
So remember, we'll be aware of the response I gave in terms of capacity constraints and the economic impact that then has on the bus industry, including operators such as First in Glasgow. And we are presently assessing the impact that any increase in service could have on them financially, and whether financial support needs to be provided in order to sustain these services, given that they effectively will be making a loss on running services where capacity is so constrained. That's a piece of work which we're taking forward at the present moment in order to assess that. What I can say to the member is that bus operators have been looking to increase frequency of services on routes where there has been greater demand. So, for example, First in Glasgow have, where they've initially been operating with a single-decker, have had double-decker buses introduced in order to help to support physical distancing. They've also looked at increasing the frequency of service on particular routes where there is an increase in demand as well. So these are issues which the Transport Transition Plan looks to try to help to support operators in taking forward, including regional transport partnerships such as SPT, in making sure that they're engaging with their transport providers in areas such as Glasgow and looking at the arrangements that they put in place to help to support and meet demand going forward. So these are all issues that are continuing to be considered, and I can assure the member the guidance which has been published today, both for the public and for operators, helps to give the public assurance and operators and their staff assurance around the approach it should be taken in dealing with these issues.
Jamie Green.
Thank you. The effects of being shut off during lockdown are felt more acutely by those in Scotland's islands. Normal ferry services have all but disappeared, tourism has disappeared, and those incomes are being lost. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how his Transport Transition Plan will offer some hope that Scotland's islands will be protected but not shut off for business? And given that most ferry services rely on substantial public subsidy to survive, has the Government revised its budget, which will be required to replace the loss of passenger revenue which so many services rely on?
Michael Matheson.
In relation to the member's latter point, yes, we already have a contract variation in place for our ferry operators that provide contracts to us in order to recognise the financial consequences of the lockdown arrangements in order to help to support the services to be sustainable, and we'll have to continue to look at putting that in place. The member raises an important point, and that is about the need to strike the balance between opening up our island communities at a proportionate and appropriate way, while not exposing our island communities to undue risk. And as I outlined earlier on, the approach we're taking as we go through the phases which were set out in the route map, we will assess the potential impact that has on transport modes, including ferry services, and what arrangements we need to put in place to meet and manage any additional demand. But as I already outlined, the reality is that even once we move our ferry services back to a normal timetable, if you like, we will be in a situation where on our largest vessels in particular, capacity will be very significantly constrained in the regions of about 17 to 18% of its normal capacity. So there will be significant constraints no matter what happens, and we need to make sure we manage those in a way that reflects the needs of the island communities and those who live in our islands.
I can squeeze in a quick question and answer, please, from Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. What advice does the Cabinet Secretary have for transport workers who are shielding? I have a shielded constituent who works for Stena Line who refused to furlough him, forcing him on to statutory sick pay. And when I approached the company, they said they were short of able seamen, suggesting that they were trying to force this vulnerable man back to work. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that that is unacceptable?
Michael Matheson.
Presiding Officer, I'm not aware of the individual case that the member made reference to, although it does strike me as being concerning if the individual concerned is shielding. And if the member wishes to provide me with further information on the matter, I'd be more than happy to look into the issue for her.
That concludes questions on the Cabinet Secretary's statement on COVID-19 transport. Apologies to Rona Mackay for not being able to reach her, and we'll now move on to the next item of business.